The morning of April 7, 1945, broke clear and brutal over Iwo Jima. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai pressed his face hard against the gun sight of his Mitsubishi Zero, watching something that shattered every conviction the Japanese military had built for 3 years. High above Tokyo Bay at 25,000 feet, American fighter aircraft moved through the sky in formation. Single-engine fighters. Not the twin-tailed lightnings that occasionally managed the impossible journey across the Pacific, but something entirely different. Sleeker machines, faster, and there were so many of them. "This cannot be happening," he muttered into his oxygen mask, his breath condensing in the freezing cockpit air. For years, Japanese planners had promised their pilots that no single-engine American fighter could possibly reach the home islands. The distances were simply too great. The fuel requirements made it mathematically impossible. The ocean itself was too vast. Yet there they were, 96 silver aircraft with distinctive bubble canopies, escorting a massive formation of B-29 superfortresses directly over the beating heart of Japan. 96 P-51D Mustangs. The numbers alone seemed to mock everything the Japanese military understood about warfare. 750 miles from Iwo Jima to Tokyo. A round trip of 1,500 miles across open water. 8 hours trapped in a cramped cockpit. Fuel consumption that should have defied the laws of physics. American engineers had achieved the impossible with a revolutionary fighter design powered by the Packard Merlin engine and equipped with external drop tank technology that changed everything. The breakthrough had come 2 months earlier, on February 19, 1945, when American Marines stormed the volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. The island was barely 8 square miles, just a speck of black sand and sulfur in the Pacific. To Japanese military commanders, it was merely another fortress in a shrinking defensive perimeter. To American strategists, it was the key that would unlock the skies over Japan itself. The battle had been savage and grinding. 36 days of fighting, nearly 6,821 American lives, another 19,217 wounded. Almost every one of the 21,000 Japanese defenders fought until death came. But even as Marines were still clearing caves and destroying bunkers, American engineers worked frantically, expanding the 3 Japanese airfields for a single specific purpose. On March 6, 1945, barely 2 weeks after the landings, 10 days before the island was declared secure, the first P-51 Mustangs touched down on the southern airfield. Young pilots climbed from their cockpits into a nightmare landscape. Trenching tools were thrust into their hands. Officers ordered them to dig foxholes immediately. Japanese soldiers were still crawling from caves to launch desperate suicide attacks. The airmen had no tents, no permanent structures, nothing but volcanic ash and the constant acrid stench of sulfur rising from Mount Suribachi. They were establishing a military airfield in the middle of an active battlefield. Major James Van der Hey, squadron commander of the 78th Fighter Squadron, stood surveying the desolate vista that would become his home. Black volcanic sand stretched endlessly in every direction. The air reeked of sulfur and death. Artillery boomed constantly from the northern end of the island, where Marines were locked in vicious hand-to-hand combat. This was where history would be written. This black, barren wasteland 750 miles south of Tokyo would become the launching point for the most ambitious fighter operation the world had ever witnessed. The pilots deployed to Iwo were mostly young men, many barely more than boys. Most had fewer than 10 hours of experience in the P-51D before arriving at this volcanic fortress. They would either learn through direct experience or they would not survive. Captain Harry Crimp Jr. of the 72nd Fighter Squadron was among the first to land on the island. At just 23 years old, he was already considered a veteran by the standards of these desperate times. The island itself proved more dangerous than the Japanese forces at first. Enemy soldiers hiding in caves meant weapons had to be carried everywhere, constantly, without exception. At night, gunfire erupted across the volcanic landscape. Grenades exploded unpredictably in the darkness. During daylight, the pilots worked on preparations for missions no one had ever attempted before. The first month on Iwo Jima was spent supporting Marines across the island and flying shorter strikes against Chichijima, 147 miles to the north. These missions were essential training. They taught pilots how to navigate over empty ocean, how to manage fuel in the unforgiving Pacific, how to survive the unique challenges of operating so far from any friendly land. The Packard Merlin engines proved reliable, but 8-hour missions would push everything to absolute limits. Spark plugs fouled in the extreme cold. Oil consumption had to be watched constantly. Any mechanical problem, no matter how small, could transform a functioning aircraft into a coffin falling toward the sea. Ground crews worked 18-hour days under brutal conditions on open airfields, maintaining these vital machines with minimal equipment and supplies. By early April, 3 fighter groups were operational on Iwo Jima. The 15th Fighter Group, the 21st Fighter Group, and the 506th Fighter Group together could launch over 100 Mustangs for major operations. The stage was set for the greatest challenge of the Pacific Air War. Tokyo lay 750 miles to the north-northwest, 750 miles of empty Pacific Ocean. 750 miles that Japanese intelligence had sworn made their homeland invulnerable to American fighters. That assumption was about to be destroyed forever. On April 6th, pilots attended briefings for what would become the first very long-range escort mission to Tokyo. The tension inside the operations tent felt almost physical. Major Vander Hay spread maps across a makeshift table and announced they would make history tomorrow by flying to the enemy capital. Nervous chatter filled the room as pilots studied routes, calculated fuel consumption, studied weather forecasts. The path seemed simple on paper, but potentially fatal in execution. Fly north-northwest for approximately 3 hours at 10,000 feet. Maintain formation discipline. Conserve fuel like their lives depended on it, because their lives absolutely did. Link up with B-29s from the 73rd Bomb Wing, approximately 20 miles south of Tokyo. Escort the bombers over their targets, engage enemy fighters, fight back home. The briefing officers spoke with brutal honesty about what awaited them. This was a 1,500-mile round trip, 8 hours minimum in cramped cockpits. No alternate landing sites anywhere. Mechanical problems meant going down in the Pacific. Search and rescue would attempt recovery, but thousands of square miles of ocean made successful rescue uncertain at best. Fuel management was everything. Every ounce mattered. Every decision counted. Instruments required constant monitoring. Smooth flying was essential. No aggressive maneuvers until drop tanks were jettisoned. Separation from formation could prove fatal because navigation over water was completely different than flying over land. There were no landmarks to guide lost pilots, just endless empty ocean in every direction. Maintenance crews worked through the entire night of April 6th, preparing 96 P-51D Mustangs. Each aircraft was meticulously inspected. Engines were tuned to perfection. Fuel systems were checked and rechecked multiple times. The 110-gallon drop tanks were filled and mounted beneath each wing. Fuselage tanks were topped off. Gun bays were loaded with 1,880 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Oxygen systems were tested thoroughly. Every detail mattered because one mechanical failure could mean the difference between life and death. April 7th dawned clear and cold over Iwo Jima. At 7 a.m., pilots began their pre-flight routines. They dressed in layers, knowing temperatures would drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude. Flight suits, Mae West life preservers, parachutes, survival kits. Each pilot carried emergency rations, water, signal flares, and shark repellent. Chances of survival if forced down in the Pacific were slim, but preparation might make the crucial difference. At 7:45 a.m., engines coughed to life across all 3 airfields. The distinctive sound of Packard Merlins echoed across the volcanic island. Pilots completed final instrument checks. Fuel gauges read full. Oxygen flow was confirmed. Radio checks completed successfully. Drop tanks were secure and properly mounted. Gun sights activated. Trim tabs set to appropriate positions. The moment had arrived. At 8 a.m. precisely, the first flight of 4 P-51Ds rolled down the runway and lifted into the morning sky. Within 20 minutes, 96 Mustangs were airborne, forming into flights of 4, squadrons of 16, groups of 48. The armada turned north-northwest and set course for Tokyo. The journey tested every aspect of pilot skill and aircraft capability. Flying in tight formation for 3 hours demanded constant concentration. The slightest deviation in throttle position affected fuel consumption significantly. Pilots maintained precise altitude, airspeed, and position continuously, climbing to 10,000 feet on oxygen, watching gauges obsessively. Fuel burn rate, oil pressure, coolant temperature, every needle, every gauge, every instrument was monitored without pause. A B-29 Super Fortress flew ahead of the fighter formation, acting as the navigation aircraft. Its sophisticated equipment and experienced navigators would guide the Mustangs to their rendezvous point. Fighter pilots followed, maintaining visual contact, trusting their instruments and hoping their calculations were accurate. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below, blue water in every direction, no ships visible, no landmarks whatsoever. Nothing but empty ocean for hundreds of miles. Some pilots experienced the psychological phenomenon known as enhanced hearing, imagining engine problems that did not exist. Every slight variation in engine tone caused momentary panic. Was that missing beat real or imagined? Was fuel consumption slightly higher than planned? Should I turn back now while I still can, or press on and hope everything works out? These thoughts plagued every pilot on that first mission to varying degrees. 2 hours into the flight, pilots began switching to their fuselage tanks, burning down the most problematic fuel supply first. The 85 gallons behind the cockpit created severe center of gravity issues when full. With all that weight aft of the pilot, the Mustang handled poorly, requiring constant back pressure on the control stick. The aircraft felt sluggish and unresponsive and vulnerable with a full fuselage tank. Pilots needed to burn that fuel quickly so they could fight effectively when they reached Tokyo. As the fuselage tanks emptied, the Mustangs gradually returned to their normal handling characteristics that made them such formidable fighters. After 2 hours and 45 minutes, the first landmark appeared on the horizon. The Japanese coast materialized ahead. Mount Fuji rose magnificently in the distance, its snow-covered peak unmistakable even from 50 miles away. Major Vanda Hay would later recall seeing the coast of Honshu and old Mount Fuji standing out exactly as it appeared in photographs. It was an unmistakable landmark. Japan, the enemy homeland. 750 miles from Iwo Jima, the impossible had been achieved. Single-engine American fighters had reached the Japanese home islands. When the Mustangs drew closer to their meeting point south of Tokyo, the pilots could finally see what they'd come to protect. Below them, the B-29 Super Fortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing were finishing their assembly. A towering formation of 103 heavy bombers stretched vertically across the sky, layered from 12,000 feet all the way up to 18,000 feet. The sight was both breathtaking and deeply unsettling. These were the largest warplanes in America's arsenal, each B-29 stretching over 99 feet in length with a 141-foot wingspan. Each one carried 20,000 pounds of destructive capability. Standing together, this fleet possessed the power to obliterate entire neighborhoods in a single pass. Weaving through the bomber formation were 96 P-51 Mustangs, their aluminum bodies polished to a mirror finish, catching and throwing back the sun's rays. The moment these fighters crossed Japan's coastline, pilots engaged a practiced motion, reaching down to yank the drop tank release handles. 220 gallons of reserve fuel tumbled away from each aircraft, plummeting down toward the dark water below. Something fundamental shifted the instant those external tanks fell away. The Mustangs became quicker on their feet, unburdened, sharper. They transformed from long-range fuel carriers back into lethal combat machines. The change was immediate and unmistakable. With those tanks jettisoned, the P-51D could punch up to 437 miles per hour and respond instantly to a pilot's touch on the control stick. What awaited them was a force that had never truly faced its equal. Japanese radar stations had picked up the approaching attack on their screens, but the data they received seemed to defy all logic. Yes, a massive wave of B-29s was heading their way, which had become almost routine by this point. But traveling alongside the bombers were dozens of single-engine fighters. The radar technicians double-checked their equipment, convinced something had malfunctioned. Single-engine fighters coming from where exactly? The American aircraft carriers were hundreds of miles distant. Iwo Jima had fallen under American control, but surely the Americans couldn't possibly extend fighter protection that far out. Yet the radar images persisted, unmistakable and undeniable. Up through the chain of command went the reports, with each level expressing more doubt than the one below. At 10:45 hours, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai received the order to scramble. At 29 years old, he stood among Japan's most accomplished combat pilots, with more than 64 confirmed enemy kills to his name. Flying since 1938, he'd seen action across China, the Philippines, and throughout the Pacific Theater. He'd endured injuries that would have claimed the lives of ordinary men, among them a head wound that had stolen the vision in his right eye. He possessed the confidence of a seasoned warrior in the cockpit of a superior machine. As he strapped himself into his Mitsubishi A6M50, Sakai harbored no doubt about what intelligence was telling him. American single-engine fighters simply could not travel the distance to Tokyo. Whatever approached had to be carrier-based Hellcats or Corsairs, opponents he'd faced many times before. The aircraft beneath him represented the pinnacle of Japanese fighter design. The A6M5 Model 52 embodied years of refinements to an already excellent airframe. It carried twin 20mm cannons and dual machine guns, powered by a Nakajima engine producing 1,130 horsepower, giving it a top speed around 351 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. What truly set it apart was its legendary turning ability. In slow-speed combat, the Zero could outmaneuver virtually every Allied fighter. Japanese pilots had built their entire fighting philosophy around this advantage since 1940. Get your adversary into a turning engagement, exploit superior maneuverability, and victory was assured. This doctrine had delivered success for 3 solid years. That was about to change with catastrophic suddenness. Around 10,000 feet, Sakai spotted them. His attention sharpened as he took in the sheer scale of the incoming formation. More than 100 B-29s, accompanied by what looked to be nearly as many fighters. The fighters were unmistakably single-engine types. They weren't Hellcats with their distinctive rotund fuselages. They weren't Corsairs with their characteristic inverted gull wings. These were something altogether different. Graceful and refined, with bubble cockpits and what appeared to be 6-gun armament, they maintained tight formations at high altitude while moving faster than any American fighter he'd previously encountered. The number was staggering. Japan's air forces, both Army and Navy, had thrown everything available in the Tokyo defense sector into the sky. Roughly 150 Japanese fighters rose to intercept, Zeros certainly, but also Kai-84 Franks, Kai-61 Tonys, N-1K Jacks, and Kai-43 Oscars, representing every fighter type Japan had produced. By April 1945, however, these forces were shadows of what they had once been. Fuel rationing meant pilots trained minimally. When the war started in 1941, Navy pilots carried roughly 700 flight hours of experience, while Army pilots had around 500 hours each. Now, in 1945, newly trained pilots were leaving flight schools with barely 40 to 70 hours total. The superbly trained aviators from Pearl Harbor and the war's opening campaigns lay in graves across the Pacific. These new pilots barely possessed the skills needed to keep their aircraft airborne, let alone engage in combat. At 11:15 hours, the first contact erupted over Tokyo Bay as the opposing fighter streams collided. What unfolded would haunt Japanese pilots for the rest of their lives. These mysterious American fighters, soon identified as P-51 Mustangs, displayed performance characteristics that seemed pulled from fantasy. When Japanese pilots attempted to engage, the Mustangs responded by accelerating away without any apparent difficulty. The P-51's 437 mile-per-hour capability gave it an 86 mile-per-hour speed advantage over the Zero. In the brutal calculus of aerial warfare, this margin represented the difference between survival and death. Zeros that had commanded the skies in earlier campaigns now found themselves utterly outclassed. Sakai lined up what appeared to be an isolated P-51, positioning himself for an attack run from above. He dove steeply, gathering momentum. As he came within firing range, he squeezed his cannon trigger. 20mm shells traced a path through the air and found nothing but empty sky. The P-51 pilot had anticipated him, made a subtle adjustment to his flight path, and accelerated. Sakai's Zero, already at its maximum speed during the dive, couldn't maintain closure. The Mustang simply pulled ahead, climbing back to altitude with power still in reserve. Sakai experienced something unexpected, something disturbing. He'd never met a fighter that could escape so effortlessly. This same sequence played out repeatedly across the sprawling battle. Japanese pilots would press attacks only to watch American pilots either counter with devastating dives or simply accelerate and disappear. The P-51's speed advantage and powerful engines delivered options that Japanese aircraft simply couldn't match. Beyond this, the Mustang mounted 650 caliber machine guns, each loaded with more than 300 rounds. Japanese pilots who had previously tangled with Hellcats and Corsairs swore the Mustang's guns hit harder, grouped more tightly, killed more thoroughly. American tactics had been honed through months of actual warfare and proved devastatingly effective. Mustang pilots underwent specific training to neutralize the Zero's traditional advantages. Never accept a low-speed turning engagement where Zeros dominated. Instead, exploit superior speed and engine power to control when and how combat occurred. Execute high-speed slashing passes, deliver short bursts from perfect range. Should the enemy survive, use superior climb performance and speed to disengage and reposition for another attack. Never, under any circumstances, slow down and attempt to outturn a Zero. The system functioned flawlessly. Japanese pilots maneuvered desperately to force turning battles. American pilots refused to participate. Captain Felix Scott of the 46th Fighter Squadron experienced one such engagement that perfectly illustrated this superiority. At 15,000 feet, he identified 3 Zeros positioned below. He rolled inverted and dove, accelerating past 400 miles per hour. Targeting the trailing Zero, he opened fire from 400 yards out. His rounds stitched across the enemy's left wing and engine. Flame and smoke erupted from the wounded fighter. Rather than attempting to turn with the remaining pair, he exploited his speed advantage to zoom climb back to 20,000 feet. The other Zeros lacked the power to follow him into that climb. He repositioned and descended for another pass. In that moment, the realization struck him fully. They possessed something revolutionary. They controlled when fighting would occur, how it would happen, and when to break it off. The Japanese had no countermeasure. Major James Tapp distinguished himself as the mission's standout performer. He engaged numerous Japanese fighters, employing textbook boom and zoom techniques to record 4 confirmed victories. Intelligence officers would later study his gun camera footage with intense interest. The recordings revealed something groundbreaking. Tapp would approach Japanese formations at high speed, typically positioning himself above or behind. He would trigger a burst from roughly 300 to 500 yards, ideal firing range. Win or lose that exchange, he immediately leveraged his speed advantage to extend separation, climb altitude, and reposition himself. Japanese pilots never received opportunity to direct effective return fire. They were simply too slow to keep pace with the Mustangs. Above the target area, B-29s endured heavy anti-aircraft barrages, but faced relatively limited fighter attacks. The P-51 escort force had scattered Japanese fighter formations before they could achieve coordinated bomber attacks. Whenever Japanese fighters moved against the B-29s, Mustang pilots would dive to intercept, compelling Japanese pilots to abandon their approaches or face destruction. The escort mission proceeded exactly according to plan. The bombers completed their assigned task, unleashing hundreds of tons of incendiary ordnance across Tokyo's manufacturing sectors. The aerial engagement above Tokyo consumed roughly 15 minutes of intense, desperate combat. When the battle concluded, the numbers told an undeniable story about shifting air superiority in the Pacific. American pilots reported 21 Japanese aircraft confirmed destroyed, with 1 additional probable and 5 damaged. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses and fighters managed to bring down 2 P-51s. A third pilot survived abandoning his aircraft after mechanical problems developed. The mathematical exchange was devastating. For every American fighter lost, more than 10 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. The truly significant element involved bomber losses. Just 3 B-29s fell to enemy action, far below the numbers typical of bombing runs lacking fighter escort. Psychologically, the impact proved even more profound. Japanese pilots returned to their bases profoundly shaken and discouraged. They described battling a completely new American fighter, one faster and more powerful, apparently capable of reaching Tokyo from bases 750 miles away. The implications were staggering, almost incomprehensible. If American fighters could protect bombers all the way to Tokyo, then Japanese air defenses had effectively ceased to exist. There remained no sanctuary, no safe area to consolidate forces and train replacement pilots without facing American air superiority. The return journey to Iwo Jima tested pilots as severely as the combat itself. They'd occupied their cockpits for over 6 hours. Physical and mental exhaustion weighed heavily. Fuel indicators displayed concerning numbers. Several pilots had 30 minutes or less remaining when Iwo Jima finally materialized on the horizon. The rocky volcanic island, barely visible through the haze, represented the most welcome sight they'd ever witnessed. The Mustangs entered the landing pattern sequentially, landing gear extended, flaps deployed, throttles pulled back, wheels touching rough tarmac, aircraft rolling to a stop, engines shutting down. Pilots extracted themselves on unsteady legs, having accomplished what many deemed impossible. Ground crews rushed toward them, firing questions rapidly. What happened up there? Did you reach Tokyo? Did you see Mount Fuji? How did the Japanese fighters handle it? What was it like staying aloft 8 hours straight? The pilots lacked energy for extensive explanations immediately. They had participated in history. They demonstrated conclusively that American fighters could shepherd bombers across 750 miles to Japanese cities. The ramifications would fundamentally alter the remaining Pacific War months. For the moment, though, sleep and food represented their sole focus. Intelligence specialists possessed less interest in pilot welfare than in extracting comprehensive mission details. Debriefing sessions commenced without delay. Each pilot underwent thorough questioning regarding fuel burn rates, engine performance, Japanese defensive tactics, and enemy force composition. Gun camera footage went through meticulous analysis and development. Kill confirmations received verification through multiple pilot reports. This initial mission's intelligence haul would shape subsequent operational planning. The fundamental conclusion mattered most. Long-range fighter escort was practical. The math on fuel calculations had proven accurate. The aircraft performed as engineers predicted. Pilots withstood the physical and mental demands of extended mission flying. Strategic bombing operations against Japan had entered a new phase, infinitely more destructive and unstoppable. For Japanese military leadership, April 7, 1945, represented the moment their air defense strategy collapsed. The bedrock assumption that single-engine American fighters couldn't reach the home islands had been demolished entirely. Within days, intelligence personnel confirmed the new fighters as P-51 Mustangs flying from Iwo Jima. They reviewed captured instruction manuals and debriefed pilots who'd encountered P-51s over European and Chinese theaters. What they discovered filled them with deep apprehension. The P-51 wasn't merely another American fighter. It stood as arguably the world's finest fighter aircraft, and it was now operating in substantial numbers over Japan. Japanese aeronautical engineers examined the P-51 specifications and capabilities with mounting despair. The Americans had engineered something without parallel, combining exceptional speed with phenomenal range, devastating firepower with adequate maneuverability, cutting-edge engineering with solid dependability. The Mustang's Packard Merlin engine represented the pinnacle of wartime aircraft engineering, unleashing 1,695 horsepower when pushed to war emergency settings. By comparison, the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine managed only 1,130 horsepower. That gap in raw power translated into measurable advantages in nearly every combat scenario. In a head-to-head matchup, the P-51 outperformed the Zero across multiple dimensions. It was quicker in level flight, climbed more rapidly, descended faster, and operated effectively at altitudes where Japanese fighters began to struggle. The drop tank system particularly caught the attention of Japanese engineers who recognized its strategic significance immediately. American pilots carrying external fuel tanks could stretch their operational range to roughly 750 miles. Once they reached their destination, they jettisoned those tanks and regained their full combat capabilities. They could engage enemy fighters over the target area, then turn for home, knowing they possessed enough internal fuel to make the journey safely. Japanese drop tanks, by contrast, were crude affairs. They were fashioned from thin metal sheets that fractured when subjected to heavy stress. They leaked fuel constantly. They created substantial aerodynamic drag, robbing aircraft of performance. They remained perpetually in short supply. Japanese fighter range remained fundamentally limited by the fuel they could carry internally. And internal fuel capacity was itself limited by aircraft design priorities that had consistently favored maneuverability over range. It was a design choice that had made sense years earlier, but had now become a strategic liability. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai recorded his reflections in his diary following that initial engagement. His words carried a weight of grim realization. "Today I saw the future, and it belongs to America. Their new fighter is superior to our Zero in every measurable way, except perhaps at low speeds where we retain some maneuverability, and their tactics prevent us from exploiting even that single advantage. They are faster, possess more powerful engines, enjoy superior firepower, maintain better radio systems, and most significantly, they possess unlimited range through their drop tank technology. We find ourselves defending our homeland with aircraft designed 5 years ago. They attack us with the most advanced fighter in the world. Unless something fundamentally shifts, I cannot see how we can prevail in this air war." The implications extended far beyond the individual aircraft themselves. American fighters now capable of shepherding bombers to their targets meant that B-29 raids would become increasingly precise, more concentrated, and catastrophically more destructive. Previously, B-29s had been forced to operate from extreme altitudes to avoid the concentrated barrage of anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks that awaited them at lower elevations. Flying so high meant bombing accuracy suffered tremendously. Now, with fighter protection, the bombers could descend, achieve better accuracy, and complete their missions while accepting losses at manageable levels. Japanese cities would burn with terrible efficiency. By mid-1945, the situation had evolved dramatically. The 2nd and 3rd Fighter Groups had achieved full operational status at Iwo Jima. The 21st Fighter Group and the 506th Fighter Group had joined the 15th Fighter Group already there, providing the 7th Fighter Command with over 150 P-51s prepared for combat operations. Operations tempo accelerated rapidly. April 12th brought another substantial escort mission aimed at Tokyo. April 16th saw the first independent fighter sweep when 57 Mustangs descended on Konoya Airfield in Kyushu, guns blazing. The psychological weight pressing down on Japanese forces intensified with each successive raid. American fighters could materialize anywhere, anytime, often with minimal warning. Japanese pilots developed a grudging respect for both the Mustang and the men who flew it. Combat reports and personal diary entries painted a consistent picture. American pilots fought with studied discipline and tactical sophistication. One report offered this observation: "The Mustang pilots fight intelligently. They deliberately refuse to engage in turning fights where we might retain some advantage. They exploit their superior speed to establish the terms of engagement. They operate in coordinated pairs, protecting each other effectively. Their aircraft quality surpasses anything we can produce. Our pilots possess courage, but courage alone cannot bridge such an enormous technical gap." The P-51's advantages were magnified by other American strengths that became increasingly evident as the campaign unfolded. American pilots arrived at combat stations with vastly superior preparation. By 1945, fresh American pilots reached their first combat mission with between 300 and 600 hours of flight experience behind them, complemented by extensive gunnery training. They had trained on current aircraft under the supervision of seasoned instructors. They possessed thorough knowledge of tactics, formation discipline, radio procedures, and emergency protocols. Japanese pilots in 1945 often arrived for combat with merely 40 to 70 hours of total flying time. Numerous pilots had never discharged their weapons at aerial targets. Some had never performed combat maneuvers in actual practice. Japan was expending young men with minimal preparation against opponents who had been meticulously trained. American logistical capabilities became increasingly apparent with each passing week. At Iwo Jima, the airfields underwent continuous expansion. The Navy Seabees labored without rest, extending runways, constructing revetments, building fuel storage areas, and establishing the infrastructure necessary for sustained operations. Replacement components arrived regularly aboard cargo vessels. Fresh aircraft flew in from Guam. Maintenance operations proceeded with proper equipment, adequate illumination, and plentiful spare parts. When a P-51 required an engine replacement, the work was completed within 48 hours. Ground crews sustained readiness rates exceeding 80%, despite the unforgiving environment and punishing operational demands. Japanese maintenance systems had effectively ceased functioning by 1945. Spare components were essentially unavailable. Aircraft sat immobilized for weeks, waiting for basic repairs. Engines deteriorated because the synthetic oil available was of poor quality. The fuel that arrived was contaminated with impurities. Airfields lacked proper maintenance infrastructure. Mechanics worked with improvised equipment out in the open, frequently facing air attacks while doing so. Japanese readiness rates plummeted below 40%. For every 3 aircraft listed on the inventory, only a fraction could actually become airborne. The machines that did fly were predominantly older designs that had been pressed far beyond their intended service lives. By 1945, the quality of Japanese aviation fuel had degraded significantly. Allied submarines had decimated Japanese tanker fleets, and bombing runs had destroyed petroleum refineries. The fuel that remained was frequently contaminated or lacked sufficient octane rating. Pilots reported rough engine operation, unexpected mechanical failures, and diminished performance. The high-octane fuel necessary for maximum engine output simply did not exist. Japanese fighters operated at reduced power, their engines throttled back to their limits just to maintain functionality. American Mustangs, conversely, ran on 100-octane aviation gasoline transported across the Pacific by ships that faced minimal opposition. American pilots could engage war emergency power, allowing their engines to reach maximum output. Japanese pilots had to treat their engines with extreme caution, simply to keep them operational. As April transitioned into May, flight operations from Iwo Jima accelerated progressively. Escort missions became routine occurrences. The Mustangs flew 3 or 4 significant missions each week when weather conditions permitted. Each mission generated additional combat records, additional claimed victories, additional proof of American air supremacy. Japanese losses accumulated steadily. By the conclusion of May, the 3 P-51 groups stationed at Iwo Jima had logged over 70 confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, with additional dozens destroyed or damaged while parked on airfields during strafing runs. The psychological burden on Japanese pilots intensified dramatically. They commenced every sortie knowing they were outgunned. Their aircraft were inadequate, their training proved insufficient. Their fuel was substandard, their maintenance capabilities were broken. Yet they received orders to attack enemy formations, protected by numerous superior fighters. The outcome was inevitable. Japanese pilot casualties climbed sharply. By late May 1945, a new Japanese fighter pilot's survival expectancy was calculated in individual missions. Numerous pilots perished on their initial combat flight. The veteran pilots, men like Saburo Sakai, endured through exceptional ability and increasingly defensive flying techniques. Even they recognized that the conflict was already decided. May 29, 1945, produced one of the Pacific War's most enormous air engagements. Approximately 450 B-29 Superfortresses, escorted by roughly 150 P-51 Mustangs, launched toward Yokohama in a massive daylight assault. Japanese defenders launched approximately 150 fighters from every available unit. The subsequent air battle encompassed over 650 aircraft. creating a churning, chaotic mass of machinery, flames, and smoke across the sky. Japanese pilots attacked with desperate determination, pressing their assaults despite facing overwhelming opposition. One particularly aggressive Japanese pilot managed to shoot down Lieutenant Rufus Maury of the 45th Squadron before being shot down himself. Watching American pilots observed with grudging respect as this unidentified Japanese fighter maneuvered through the escort formation with remarkable skill before sheer numbers overwhelmed him. The mission on May 29th demonstrated the effectiveness and constraints of American fighter escort operations. Despite approximately 150 fighters protecting the bombers, determined Japanese pilots succeeded in damaging 175 B-29s and destroying 5. American fighters claimed 26 Japanese aircraft shot down, demonstrating that determination could still produce consequences even when confronting superior forces. Nevertheless, the exchange ratio decidedly favored the Americans. Japanese casualties remained unsustainable. American losses remained manageable. That mathematical reality established the war's trajectory. June 1, 1945, earned the designation Black Friday among the Mustang pilots based at Iwo Jima. That day revealed that the greatest threat confronting American pilots was not Japanese aerial opposition, but rather the vast Pacific and the violent weather systems crossing it. 148 P-51 Mustangs took off for an escort mission targeting Osaka. Weather briefings suggested scattered clouds and nothing particularly concerning. What materialized proved disastrous. Roughly 370 miles north of Iwo Jima, the fighter formation encountered an enormous weather system, towering from the surface upward past 23,000 feet. The formation attempted to force its way through the massive thunderstorms and was ripped apart by savage turbulence. With zero visibility in violent conditions, multiple P-51s collided with each other in the clouds. Others were thrown into uncontrollable dives or spins and plunged into the ocean. Certain pilots became thoroughly disoriented and flew randomly until their fuel depleted. 27 Mustangs went down that day. 24 pilots perished. None fell to enemy gunfire. All were killed by weather and the merciless Pacific Ocean. The 506th Fighter Group, which had been operational for merely 2 weeks, suffered losses of 15 aircraft and 12 pilots in a single day. It remains among the worst non-combat disasters of the entire Pacific War. Black Friday underscored the hazards of ultra-long-range operations. Japanese fighters posed genuine dangers, yet they killed relatively few American pilots statistically. Weather complications, navigation errors, mechanical breakdowns, and fuel exhaustion proved far deadlier. From April through August 1945, the 7th Fighter Command lost roughly 180 P-51s during Pacific operations. Fewer than 30 of these losses stemmed from Japanese fighters. The remainder were operational losses attributable to weather encounters, accidents, mechanical problems, and pilots who ran out of fuel and went down in the ocean. The Pacific represented a vast, unforgiving environment that proved lethal regardless of flying skill. Rescue operations supporting the ultra-long-range missions became legendary. Submarines stationed along the route to Japan served as rescue services, plucking downed pilots from the water. Destroyer flotillas patrolled specific zones. PBY Catalina flying boats and other amphibious aircraft conducted search missions, prepared to land on the ocean and retrieve distressed airmen. The rescue program achieved remarkable success. Approximately 60% of pilots who ditched in the Pacific during these operations made it back alive. Lieutenant Frank Ayres of the 15th Fighter Group survived rescue twice. His first rescue came after 430 miles of ocean separated him from Iwo Jima, when mechanical problems forced him to abandon his P-51. A destroyer retrieved him. 2.5 months afterward, after battling 3 Japanese fighters, Ayres ejected again. This time he splashed down so near a rescue submarine that he never even needed to deploy his life raft. By July 1945, the nature of aerial warfare above Japan had transformed fundamentally. Japanese fighter activity dropped significantly. Many remaining Japanese aircraft were being preserved for the anticipated American invasion of the home islands. Japanese military planners chose to conserve their shrinking fighter inventory for kamikaze operations against invasion armadas. rather than expend it in futile air-to-air battles against technically superior American pilots. Consequently, numerous P-51 missions encountered minimal or non-existent enemy resistance. The Mustangs redirected their attention toward ground attack operations, hitting airfields and industrial complexes with gun runs. Ground attack missions presented dangers comparable to or exceeding air combat in certain respects. Operating at low altitude through torrential anti-aircraft fire tested pilots' nerves and produced casualties. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners developed considerable proficiency tracking fast-moving targets. Mustangs raced across airfields at 350 miles per hour. Their 50-caliber machine guns shredded parked aircraft and facilities. Anti-aircraft positions tracked them relentlessly, unleashing volleys of explosive shells and machine gun tracer fire. Numerous Mustangs returned to Iwo Jima bearing flak damage. Numerous others never returned. Nevertheless, the ground attack campaign proved devastatingly effective. From April through August 1945, P-51s operating from Iwo Jima claimed destruction or significant damage to over 1,000 Japanese aircraft sitting on the ground. These claims likely contained exaggeration, as combat claims commonly do, yet declassified Japanese records substantiate that ground attacks annihilated their remaining air forces. Japanese aircraft suffering American strafing damage frequently sustained such severe harm they never flew again. Japan's already depleted fighter strength was systematically destroyed airfield by airfield. Japanese countermeasures evolved throughout the summer of 1945, yet realistic options remained severely restricted. They could not manufacture fighters approaching Mustang performance. Their aircraft industrial capacity, devastated by sustained strategic bombing, struggled producing even older aircraft designs. They could not develop pilots reaching American training standards because fuel limitations meant minimal training sorties. They could not match American supply capabilities because the submarine blockade had effectively severed their supply routes. They could not devise successful tactics against an adversary possessing overwhelming technical superiority. By August 1945, Japanese air defenses had essentially disintegrated. August 10, 1945, brought the final major combat mission flown by Mustangs from Iwo Jima during World War II. The 15th and 506th Fighter Groups tangled with Japanese fighters near Tokyo and claimed 7 victories. 5 days later, Japan surrendered unconditionally. The conflict had ended. Between April 7 and August 15, 1945, the Mustangs from Iwo Jima completed 51 significant missions into Japanese airspace. They provided escort for hundreds of B-29 bombing runs, conducted numerous independent fighter sweeps and ground attack operations, and secured total American air superiority throughout Japan. The statistics presented the ultimate narrative of air superiority, won through technological superiority, outstanding pilot preparation, and industrial capacity without equal. The 7th Fighter Command's P-51s earned credit for 206 confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat from April through August 1945, accounting for 75% of all P-51 aerial victories throughout the Pacific Theater. The 15th Fighter Group led all units with 111 confirmed victories. The 21st Fighter Group accumulated 71. The 506th Fighter Group, despite arriving late in the campaign and suffering heavily on Black Friday, still achieved 24 confirmed victories. 5 American pilots earned ace status flying from Iwo Jima. Major James Tapp achieved this distinction first on April 19, when he eliminated his 5th Japanese target. Over the 4 months of this intensive air campaign, American fighter forces lost roughly 180 P-51s in total. What's remarkable is that fewer than 30 of those aircraft fell to Japanese fighter opposition. The remainder were lost to mechanical failures, fuel miscalculations, weather, and the simple wear and tear of pushing machines and men to their absolute limits. The numbers told a story of overwhelming American superiority in the air. For every Japanese fighter shot down, American forces eliminated more than 7 enemy aircraft. Japanese pilots found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and flying machines that simply couldn't keep pace with what they faced. When Japanese flyers did manage victories, they achieved them through last-resort tactics that demanded suicide-like commitment. sacrifices that bled their already depleted pilot corps white. Decades after the war ended, Japanese pilots who survived carried vivid, almost haunting memories of encountering those P-51 Mustangs above their home islands. The experience had shattered something fundamental in them, the deeply held belief that Japanese martial spirit and warrior determination could overcome material disadvantage. That assumption lay broken on the runway of reality. American aircraft were superior. American pilots had better preparation. American tactics proved more effective. And American numbers were simply overwhelming. By August 1945, Japan possessed no advantage in any dimension of aerial warfare. Saburo Sakai survived the war despite carrying grievous wounds and enduring years of relentless combat. In his post-war reflections, he wrote about the P-51 with something approaching awe mixed with despair. The Mustang, he reflected, was nothing short of magnificent. Fast beyond what Japanese engineers had anticipated, tremendously powerful, capable of flying extraordinary distances, bristling with weaponry. When those sleek silver fighters first appeared circling Tokyo, Sakai knew with absolute certainty that Japanese hopes had evaporated. The nation was now defending itself with aircraft that belonged to yesterday, flown by young pilots with minimal preparation, burning contaminated fuel, all while facing an adversary whose resources seemed genuinely limitless. The gulf in capability was simply insurmountable. A P-51 pilot could fly 1,500 miles, wage battle over Japanese cities, and return safely to base. Japanese pilots were constrained by machines that barely allowed 200 miles of meaningful operation before fuel concerns became desperate and they had to turn back toward home. The technological canyon between the two aircraft was too wide to cross. Beyond the statistics and performance specifications, the P-51's strategic meaning penetrated deep into Japanese consciousness. The very existence of this sophisticated fighter, produced in massive quantities, demonstrated something far larger than military capability. It proved that American factories could manufacture fighters as advanced as anything on Earth, and do so by the thousands. Americans had pioneered drop-tank technology that extended range. Americans had seized an island just 2 miles long and converted it into an enormous airbase within weeks, positioning it 1,000 miles from any major supply source, yet keeping it fully operational. Americans possessed the logistical wizardry to maintain sustained operations across the vast Pacific expanse. If Americans could accomplish all this, the implication became inescapable. There existed no practical limit to what American industry might achieve. This realization struck Japanese military leadership with psychological force equivalent to battlefield defeat. The contrast between American and Japanese aviation by mid-1945 was simply brutal and unforgiving. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,318 aircraft, including more than 12,000 P-51 Mustangs. Japanese production that same year totaled approximately 28,000 aircraft across all types. Yet quantity masked a deeper catastrophe in quality. Many of those aircraft represented obsolete designs, and quality control had deteriorated so severely that many machines were barely capable of staying airborne. By 1945, production had collapsed entirely under relentless bombing and critical material shortages. Entire factories were destroyed or scattered into caves and mountain tunnels, where any meaningful manufacturing became nearly impossible. Quality standards simply vanished. Aircraft that emerged from assembly areas frequently carried misaligned components, substandard materials, and defective systems that should never have been accepted. American pilot preparation by 1945 represented the most comprehensive military training apparatus the world had yet witnessed. Pilots progressed through successive stages: primary training, basic training, advanced training, operational training, before ever reporting to combat squadrons. They trained on multiple aircraft types, mastered instrument flying, spent hours on gunnery ranges, studied tactics from instructors who had themselves survived combat, and arrived at their units with hundreds of hours of flight experience beneath their belts. Japanese pilot training in 1945 consisted of something far different. Young men received minimal flight time in obsolete trainers. Gunnery practice was virtually non-existent because ammunition had become impossibly scarce. Instruction from experienced veterans was minimal because so few experienced pilots remained alive. Essentially, Japan was sending fresh pilots into combat with barely token preparation, which meant sending them to almost certain death. Japan's fuel crisis epitomized the nation's unraveling industrial foundation. American B-29 bombers and submarines had systematically demolished Japan's oil refineries and destroyed the tanker ships that transported fuel. By mid-1945, Japan possessed merely 8% of the aviation fuel needed to maintain any kind of sustained air operations. What fuel reserves did exist were frequently contaminated with impurities that destroyed engines. Training missions were simply cancelled. Operational sorties were minimized to absolute necessity. Aircraft sat idle on airfields because there was nothing to put in their tanks, while American Mustangs cruised continuously overhead with full fuel loads. The psychological torment this created proved almost unbearable. Japanese personnel possessed aircraft but lacked the fuel to fly them. They had pilots but lacked the fuel to properly train them. They possessed fierce determination to fight but lacked the material means to do so effectively. The April 7, 1945 appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo represented far more than simply another fighter type entering combat. It represented the complete culmination of American industrial mobilization, the strategic brilliance of Allied planning, and the inevitable result when unlimited resources collided with constrained ones. Every single Mustang that traversed Japanese skies carried with it the accumulated weight of American civilization. Aluminum extracted from Tennessee mines through 3 daily shifts, petroleum flowing from Texas oil fields, thousands of training bases stretching across the continental United States, transport vessels continuously crossing the Pacific, the scientific achievements that created the Packard Merlin engine, the engineering innovation behind drop tank development, the tactical wisdom that forged effective fighter escort doctrine. The Mustang transcended its nature as merely another fighter aircraft. It was American industrial civilization condensed and concentrated into 11,600 pounds of aluminum and steel. Japanese pilots comprehended this reality instinctively. When they observed Mustangs circling over Tokyo at 25,000 feet, they saw far more than enemy fighters. They saw their own defeat made tangible and visible. They saw conclusive proof that Japan had confronted the world's supreme industrial power and lost decisively. They understood that every claim about Japanese spirit conquering American material advantages had always been propaganda, hollow words without substance. Superior warrior spirit could not overcome an 86-mile-per-hour speed disadvantage. Bushido ethos could not match 50-caliber machine guns unleashing 5,000 rounds per minute. Samurai resolve could not extend a fighter's combat radius by 300 additional miles. Technical and industrial realities operated according to their own unforgiving logic. Japanese civilians experienced the psychological impact with equal intensity, though they lacked the technical knowledge pilots possessed. They could witness American fighters wheeling overhead without meaningful opposition. They grasped the terrifying implication: if enemy fighters could reach Tokyo without restraint, then nowhere on the Japanese home islands remained safe. The manufactured propaganda about Japan's defensive invulnerability, the rhetoric about invasion impossibility, the claims about an unbreakable home island fortress, all of it crumbled to dust as civilians watched American aircraft day after endless day, unopposed and unmolested. The reality of defeat became impossible to deny or rationalize. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, compiled after the war concluded, confirmed what Japanese military personnel and civilians had experienced directly. American air superiority over Japan by summer 1945 was complete and irreversible. The compound effect of strategic bombing destroying productive capacity, submarine blockade, strangling resource imports, and overwhelming Allied technical and numerical superiority in combat created circumstances where Japan's air forces could no longer contest American operations. The P-51 played a critical role in establishing this overwhelming dominance. By providing comprehensive bomber escort, the Mustang enabled bombing campaigns of devastating scope that accelerated Japan's economic and industrial collapse. The historical irony cuts deeply. Japan had once fielded one of the world's finest fighter designs. The Mitsubishi Zero that emerged in 1940 was genuinely revolutionary, combining unprecedented range with outstanding maneuverability and respectable firepower capabilities. For 18 months, the Zero dominated the skies above the Pacific. Pilots flying Zeros accumulated hundreds of confirmed victories while suffering minimal losses themselves. Yet Japan failed catastrophically to develop successor designs with sufficient speed. The Zero's airframe was subjected to various modifications, attempting to extend its operational life, but fundamentally it remained a 1940-era design fighting in 1945. American aircraft development, by contrast, proceeded with relentless acceleration and innovation. The P-51 Mustang embodied 1944-era technological advancement, equipped with substantially more powerful engines, metallurgical innovations, superior systems integration, and the revolutionary drop tank design. 5 years separated Zero from Mustang, and those 5 years represented the distance between competitive and obsolete. Japan's failure to maintain technological parity with American developments reflected deeper structural limitations in strategy and industrial capacity. The Japanese economy simply lacked depth and flexibility. Once supplies of critical materials were exhausted, Japan could not substitute alternatives on necessary scales. The Zero's exceptional maneuverability derived from lightweight construction using aluminum alloys with precise chemical composition. As war continued and material shortages intensified, Japanese aircraft were assembled using inferior alloys, recycled materials salvaged from destroyed aircraft, and increasingly wooden components. Performance degraded predictably and severely. American aircraft operated under entirely different conditions. Supplies of high-quality materials remained effectively unlimited. P-51s contained no substitute aluminum. Mustang fuel tanks held no contaminated gasoline. Merlin engines contained no improvised components or substandard parts. Quality remained constant and reliable because supply chains remained intact and functioning. The training gap similarly emerged from resource limitations. Japanese pilot training had been excellent when experienced instructors were available, fuel was plentiful, and adequate time existed for thorough preparation. As experienced pilots died in combat, training quality suffered because fewer qualified instructors remained alive to teach. As fuel became desperately scarce, training flights were curtailed because operational requirements took absolute priority. As the war deteriorated, pilot training was compressed into shorter timeframes because replacements were urgently needed at the front. The system entered a vicious downward spiral. Poorly trained pilots died quickly in combat, creating demand for replacement pilots who received even less training, flying even less fuel, instructed by ever fewer experienced mentors. American pilot training suffered no comparable constraints. The United States possessed abundant fuel supplies, numerous experienced pilots rotated from combat units specifically for training duty, and sufficient time to properly prepare pilots before combat deployment. The strategic implications of Mustangs appearing over Tokyo extended well beyond immediate air combat. Japanese military leaders grasped immediately that if American fighters could escort bombers throughout Japan while maintaining operational control, then the anticipated invasion of the home islands would proceed under completely uncontested American air superiority. Invasion beaches would not face Japanese air opposition. Landing craft would never be attacked by Japanese aircraft. The invasion fleet would conduct operations utterly free from air threat. This realization contributed significantly to Japan's decision to surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japanese leadership recognized that continued resistance was militarily pointless. They could neither defend their airspace, protect their cities, nor resist invasion under such circumstances. The P-51's demonstrated dominance served as one factor among many that drove Japan toward accepting defeat. In subsequent decades, aviation historians and military analysts have consistently ranked the P-51 Mustang among the greatest fighter aircraft ever constructed. The combination of performance, range, reliability, and combat effectiveness established it as the standard by which other fighters have been measured ever since. The Mustang served in air forces globally well into the 1950s. It saw action in Korea. It performed counterinsurgency missions into the 1980s. Individual P-51s remain airworthy today, preserved by devoted collectors and displayed at air shows where audiences appreciate this historically significant machine. For pilots who flew Mustangs from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back, the aircraft held profound personal significance. These men had executed missions that pushed human and mechanical capability toward their absolute limits. 8-hour flights across hostile ocean to fight above enemy territory and return demanded exceptional courage, extraordinary skill, and complete unwavering confidence in their machine. The Mustang never betrayed that trust. Packard Merlin engines ran smoothly through hour upon hour of sustained operation. Fuel systems delivered consistently. Hydraulics functioned reliably. Guns fired precisely when needed. Every system performed exactly as designed under the most extraordinarily demanding conditions imaginable. This reliability stood as the ultimate testament to American engineering excellence and manufacturing quality. The P-51 was built correctly, and it performed flawlessly when the stakes were highest and the consequences were most severe. Japanese pilots who fought Mustangs over Tokyo retained entirely different memories. They remembered the precise moment when reality struck. Their beloved Zero was obsolete. They remembered watching American fighters accelerate away with effortless ease. They remembered the awful helplessness of being outmatched in every conceivable aspect of aerial combat. They remembered the dread sensation of watching fuel gauges descend toward empty, because Japanese fighters possessed insufficient range to pursue enemies back toward Iwo Jima. Most profoundly, they remembered shock and disbelief when they first witnessed American single-engine fighters operating over Tokyo on April 7, 1945, accomplishing what their own military intelligence had absolutely assured them was impossible. The technological surprise represented total intelligence failure. Japanese military planners had failed to anticipate that American engineers would achieve drop tank reliability and capacity sufficient to extend fighter range to 1,600 miles. They had never imagined American industry could produce fighters with 1,795 horsepower engines in such vast quantities as to equip entire air groups. They had dismissed the possibility that Americans would seize Iwo Jima and transform it into a major operational airbase within 6 weeks. At every critical point, Japanese assessments of American capabilities proved disastrously incorrect. American technological and industrial capacity consistently exceeded Japanese expectations by extraordinary margins. The final statistical accounting of the Very Long-Range Campaign illustrated American air superiority with perfect clarity. Between April and August 1945, P-51 groups flying from Iwo Jima conducted approximately 2,800 sorties directed at the Japanese home islands. They destroyed 206 Japanese aircraft through aerial combat and damaged or destroyed over 600 additional aircraft on the ground. They escorted more than 1,000 B-29 bomber missions, achieving mission success rates exceeding 95%. American losses totaled approximately 180 aircraft, with fewer than 30 lost to actual enemy action. The remainder represented operational losses encountered in one of history's most demanding operational environments. The exchange ratio, the effectiveness rate, and the mission accomplishment all demonstrated that the 7th Fighter Command's Mustang operations achieved their strategic objectives completely and decisively. The fundamental lesson emerging from P-51 operations over Tokyo was straightforward and enduring. Warfare between industrial powers is ultimately determined by the side capable of producing superior equipment in greater quantities. Japanese pilots possessed genuine bravery. Japanese aircraft design displayed real creativity. Japanese tactical doctrine was fundamentally sound based on early war experience. None of this mattered when confronting an enemy possessing overwhelming technical and numerical superiority. The Mustang represented the concrete result. When advanced design, superb engineering, quality production, adequate resources, excellent training, and sound tactics converge and combine. The April 7, 1945 mission marked the beginning of the end for Japanese air power. From that day forward, American fighters operated over Japan with increasing frequency and progressively decreasing opposition. By August, American forces possessed complete and undisputed control of Japanese airspace. The strategic bombing campaign proceeded with devastating effectiveness precisely because bombers flew under protective fighter escort. Japanese cities burned because American bombers could release their ordnance from lower altitudes while receiving fighter protection. The atomic bombs were delivered by B-29s that encountered minimal opposition because Japanese fighters had been systematically swept from the skies by P-51 Mustangs and their sister aircraft. The legacy of those intense operational months persists within air power doctrine. The principle that bombers require fighter escort was proven absolutely and conclusively over Japan. The critical importance of aircraft performance, particularly speed and range, was demonstrated repeatedly and with brutal clarity. The value of quality pilot training became evident through the exchange ratios achieved. The necessity of industrial capacity to sustain prolonged operations was confirmed beyond any doubt. All these lessons shaped post-war military aviation development and remain profoundly relevant today. For Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, watching those initial P-51s circle above Tokyo represented simultaneously an ending and a revelation. His personal war was effectively finished, despite continuing to fly until Japan's surrender. His nation's hope for ultimate victory had dissolved, though official military propaganda would maintain the pretense for 4 remaining months. His confidence in Japanese technological superiority shattered irreversibly, replaced by clear-eyed understanding of genuine American capabilities. In that moment of recognition, as he observed silver Mustangs turning through the sky 750 miles beyond their base, Sakai comprehended with absolute certainty that Japan had challenged the world's greatest industrial power and received an unforgiving lesson. American resources, American engineering, American production machinery, American training systems, and American fighting determination had combined to create a war machine that Japan simply could not possibly match. The P-51 Mustangs circling overhead transcended their nature as mere fighters. They functioned as heralds announcing Japan's defeat, symbols proclaiming American triumph, proof incarnate that in modern warfare industrial capacity ultimately determines the victor. The shock waves from that first mission reverberated through Japanese military and civilian consciousness alike. What military planners had deemed impossible was now routine reality. American fighters over Tokyo, American bombers protected by entire swarms of escorts, American air superiority absolute and utterly unchallengeable. The psychological impact proved as devastating as physical destruction. When your nation's skies belong to your enemy, when fighters you cannot match circle overhead unchallenged, when each passing day delivers fresh evidence of your absolute inferiority, hope simply dies. That death of hope, more fundamentally than any single military defeat, propelled Japan toward acceptance of surrender. The men who flew those Mustangs from Iwo Jima earned their permanent position in aviation history through accomplishment of missions that tested human endurance and aircraft capability to their absolute limits. They fought and won against determined enemies. They pioneered long-range fighter operations that revolutionized air warfare forever. Their achievement was certainly enabled by superior equipment, yet equipment alone remained insufficient. Skill, courage, discipline, and fierce determination proved equally essential. The combination of America's finest fighter aircraft, flown by America's best-trained pilots, against an adversary equipped with obsolete machines and desperate resolve, produced the outcome reflected plainly in the statistics. American dominance was complete, Japanese resistance was broken, and the path toward final victory became unmistakably clear.